Couple announcements real quick. We're having a chili cook-off at the VFW on September 14th. If anyone's interested in cooking your chili, go ahead and stop on by. There's information on there. You can send an email as well. Or if you just want to come eat the chili, that's what. Oh, here we have some more people coming. Great. You know, we have some guests from LA today. Brett, thank you for coming down. Appreciate that. And here comes some more. It's a good thing. So, my name's Stephen Gama. I'm a volunteer here at the Port Hueneme Historical Society Museum. And Larry Downey is our guy that makes all this happen. He's shy. He's over there hiding right now. How you doing? A couple more people. Come on in. We're just getting started. So, if you're not aware, there's a Banana Festival coming up September 28th. Out of town people, you might want to consider coming back. It's a real great way to get to know the port. There's tours, a lot of fun activities, and you'll get to learn about bananas. Lots of bananas. The West Coast supply of bananas comes through Port Hueneme, so it's a fun event. Today, and also we have sign-up list for tours of the port and the lighthouse. If you're interested in that, you can check it out. And today, we get to have Ranier Buschmann. He is a professor of history at the University of Cal State University, Channel Islands. And he's going to deliver a fascinating talk today about World War I. And I have heard this before, and it's very, very interesting. And so I want you all to get ready to learn a few things and be enamored by his wit.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me here again. And thank you for showing up and making the long trip from Los Angeles. Thank you. Much appreciated. And for joining me here on a Saturday. Beautiful Saturday, by the way. This summer has been great. I don't know if it's the same. I live up in Ojai, and it's been really a blessing this summer. It hasn't been as hot as the last few summers. So I'm here to talk to you about World War I. Not just the whole conflict, but really the very end of it. This talk is it's going to be about 45 minutes or so, and then at the end we'll have some time for questions. So especially since I'm going to run through some things very quickly, if you need to know more, I don't know, Russian Revolution, other things, we can talk about that at the end of the talk. So what I wanted to say also is this particular talk is part of a lecture that I co-teach at Cal State Channel Islands, which is History and Psychology of World War I. And we have taught this class now, I believe, 2 or 3 times very successfully. And we will probably teach it again 2021, so it's going to be a while. But if you're interested in joining that course, you're more than welcome. So this particular lecture is about the end of World War I, and there's a lot of controversy over this. Controversy because there's numerous historians, especially since the 1990s, that basically argue that there was no end to World War I. There's really a transition between World War I and World War II, and some people are calling it now the new 30-year war. So in other words, that lasts between 1914 and 1945. And the way these historians work is they stretch World War I into the 1920s, especially with the Russian Civil War and numerous other conflicts going on in Europe and elsewhere. And then you're, of course, stretching World War II back into the 1930s, where you're talking about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, Japanese conflict in China, and numerous other conflicts to really show that this conflict never ended. And really, the Paris Peace Treaties, I'm going to talk about them a little bit at the end of my lecture, didn't really end the war, but just created the conditions for the second one to take off. So let me get started with an unusual map. There we go. This is a map of World War I that you don't often see. This map illustrates all the different warring parties. So everything that you see shaded in green, I know it's a little hard to see from the back. I do have a laser pointer, that helps. So everything that you see shaded in green, these are the so-called Central Powers. They're also known as the Triple Alliance, and it usually involves Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, with Bulgaria joining in later in the conflict. So you basically, that's why the Central Powers, because they're located right in the center of the world. Everything that you see shaded in, what color is that?
Purple.
Thank you. Purple. Colorblind. So, these are the so-called allies. So the most important ones, of course, you know about England, Russia, France, and of course after 1917, the United States of America. But you can see that there's numerous other countries involved as well: Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, many of the Central American countries. And really you see that only very few spots on this map were deemed neutral. There were very few neutral countries. Some of the most obvious one is, of course, Switzerland. Switzerland is very smart in staying out of the conflict because you can then finance both parties. The same thing applies also for Sweden, that at that point also had parts of Norway. Sweden is a major supplier of raw material, so they too stayed out of conflict. And again, Spain wasn't so much involved in this conflict because they were just going through some major financial hardship, major revolution in their own country. So there are some countries that didn't take place, but you can see that all the purple ones clearly outnumber, the Central Powers. So when you're looking at this map, it's sort of easy to see that the outcome would ultimately turn against the Central Powers, especially after 1917, as the United States would join into the conflict. The other thing that this map nicely shows is not only the main countries were involved, but this is also the period of high imperialism. So you have countries with a large empire, especially Great Britain and France, and of course all of these empires, all of these colonies were also dragged into the conflict. That's why it becomes a global conflict, a world war. It's interesting, we call it World War I. Have you heard, this historians have now brought up a new term. Have you ever heard of World War Zero? That is actually the French and Indian War. A lot of people see now World War Zero as the French and Indian War, the first major global conflict, because it was fought in India, it was fought here, it was fought in Europe. So it's a very interesting new terms. Historians are very good at creating new terms. I mean, I know they're going to stick or not, but they're very good at doing this. So what we have here is, for instance, you can see that most of Africa is involved in the conflict. That also because Germany did have some colonies in Africa. Germany also had some colonies in Asia and the Pacific. So all of these, of course, were also drawn into the conflict. And this is how I'm going to start, by basically saying that World War I ended very quickly in certain places. It was over in some places, within a month. The war breaks out in August of 1914, and in end of August, and moving into September of 1914, the Germans pretty much lose Togo, Samoa, German New Guinea, and by November you can throw in Qingdao, a port city that we're holding in China, simply because there were no major troops stationed there. So the Germans made a little bit of an effort to resist, but it was all about, for the honor. Ultimately, they were overrun. The interesting thing is that the Germans, before the conflict broke out, actually had signed a treaty, the so-called Treaty of Berlin, which was about colonialism. And the treaty basically argued that should the war break out, the colonies would remain neutral. Everybody disrespected the treaty. Of course, the Germans did so too. It's interesting that in Togo, the Germans were the first ones to start shooting. But what we get is that you have a major conflict and also numerous indigenous peoples who were dragged into this conflict as well. One of the major newest contributions that we have to World War I is realizing the great contribution that people from Africa, people from Asia, people from the Pacific actually did on World War I, and we don't often reflect that. So here's a couple of examples. This, for instance, is an East African askari, a German for the colonial troops. This is a very sad image, which it's interesting if you contrast to what's going on in August in Europe. where everybody's cheering as the troops march to the front line. This is a lot more somber. Here you see no cheering, but you see this soldier basically taking his leave from the family. I was very sad of seeing him go. The other thing is that the conflict that you find, for instance, in Africa is not the same kind of conflict that you have on the Western Front. It's a conflict that often involves carriers, because everything needed to be carried. Especially in Germany, East Africa, you had the tsetse fly that would kill beasts of burden, where horses or other animals could not be used for the conflict. So often you had, for every soldier that was doing the fighting, you had to have 4 to 5 carriers just carrying supplies into the conflict. So there's this whole statistical blind spot that we hadn't considered really until the 1990s. So, but both of these things are just an illustration that there is warfare everywhere. As I said, most German colonies were conquered by about 1915, 1916. Cameroon falls in 1916 as the second to last colony. There was only one colony, Germany, East Africa, that fought to the very end. And the only reason they were able to hold out is because they resorted to a different kind of warfare, where you don't fight people in the open, but you basically fight them where they're weakest, guerrilla warfare. So, and the role of disease, of course, plays a big role here. I mentioned that already before, the tsetse fly, killing off many of the beast of burdens. So, in that sense, the war already came to a conclusion in many places around the earth shortly after the outbreak. But it raged on for about 4 years. One of the other interesting aspects, and some people had already done research over this in the 70s, 80s, but there's more research on this right now, is peace initiatives. There were actually many. There were attempts to come to peace, especially after the really eventful year of 1916, where there was a lot of bloodletting on the Western Front, the Eastern Front. So some of the peace initiatives were put forward, but in the case of Germany, when you're talking about peace initiative, you always have to keep in mind that the Germans were always out to divide and conquer. They offered certain peace initiatives to France and Russia, but that's basically to drive them apart and therefore create a better position for themselves. Austria-Hungary is a power that increasingly after 1916 became weaker and weaker and was sending out peace feelers, but most of their initiatives didn't amount to much. Lastly, as we move into 1970, there was also a peace initiative by the Pope coming from the Vatican. Again, didn't have much success because nobody could come to an agreement of how to end the war. The best one was, of course, the proposal put forward by President Woodrow Wilson from the United States of America, the so-called 14 points. And this one, as it says, the status quo ante bellum, would like to return everything as it was before the war. In the points, for instance, there was an addressing of new nations that would emerge. There was an addressing to stop unrestricted submarine warfare, for the British Navy to stop its blockade of German ports, and etc., etc. So that was considered, but really the consideration came towards the end of the war, when the war was getting really bad, especially for the Central Powers. Let me talk a little bit about some peace initiatives that are often neglected. And when I talk about peace initiatives, I want you to think peace instead of quotation marks, because it's not really about peace, it's about conquest. And this is what the Germans had in mind. It was sometimes called peace by capitulation. Or the German term is Siegfrieden, which means victory peace, or peace that comes out of victory. So, and a couple of examples of this are peace treaties that the Germans drew up to basically take Russia out of the war. At that point, Russia was already becoming the Soviet Union, since you had the October Revolution, and the Bolsheviks under Lenin and under Trotsky were basically negotiating some sort of peace agreement with the Germans. So, but this peace by capitulation, because these were very harsh peace treaties that the Germans imposed on these individuals. Just to give you a couple of examples, they took away about 50% of the population, 80% of the resources that these countries had. And there were really harsh peace treaties, and it showed already to the Allies that the only way the Germans would come to a conclusion of this war would be through some of these strategies, not good ones. For the Germans, of course, these treaties meant that they could use many of the troops that were fighting either in Romania or fighting in Russia, take them away from the Eastern Front and push them towards the West for one major offensive, which would come in March of 1918. I'll talk more about this. But, there's a big but, because a lot of people say, oh, this is a great advantage for the Germans. There's a lot of people who have looked at this now, and they actually realized that not all the troops could be taken from the East, simply because you still needed German troops in the East to patrol that what you had gained from these peace treaties. And the other thing is that these peace treaties drove a major wedge between Germany and her allies, especially the Bulgarians and the Ottomans. Because the Bulgarians and Ottomans were hoping to get a lot of real estate from these treaties, and the Germans had none of this. Especially with the Ottomans, they were fighting over the Caucasus area, which is traditionally Muslim, and the Ottoman Empire saw itself as the sort of guiding, the protecting power of the Muslims, and it was also extremely resource-rich in terms of petrol. So we have already a lot of disagreements happening. And the Ottoman Empire is really where the sort of collapse starts to begin during World War I. I'm not going to talk too much about it. If you want, we can talk. There's a lot of writing there. So let me just do this very quickly. What you have is that the Ottoman Empire is always considered, much like Italy in World War II, the soft underbelly of the Central Powers. That's where you can launch your campaigns and make major progress. Although the Ottoman Empire was able to repel some of the attacks, the most important one was success on the Gallipoli Peninsula between 1915 and 1916. The Allies were making major progress, especially in the Middle East. And part of this was also because the Allies were able to appeal to many of the minorities within the Ottoman Empire. Turks, who were in charge of the Ottoman Empire, were really a minority, and there was a lot of other, including Armenian Christians, of course, Jewish individuals, you had Arabs, all of these had different kind of points of interest, and then you have individuals like Lawrence of Arabia, who of course is able to rise up the Arabs against the Turks. So because of this, you have major setbacks that are happening on the Ottoman front. And the Ottoman front, by 1917, 1918, is basically withdrawing and crumbling. And the Germans send advisors, but they don't really send a whole lot of troops to stabilize that particular front, because the Germans, of course, were looking elsewhere. And they were hoping that by defeating the Western Allies, they would somehow gain an advantage. Here, again, a couple of perspectives. Two of the German allies were multi-ethnic empires that were basically, by 1917, 1918, were threatening to collapse. Collapse because many of the minorities there were starting to negotiate already on their own. You probably know this, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire, even if it's run by German-speaking individuals, you basically have Hungarians, you have Croats, you have Serbs, you have all kinds of different ethnic groups, Ukrainians, Slovaks, Czechs, just to mention a few. And the same thing, of course, also applies for the Ottoman Empire. Only the Ottoman Empire is a great deal bigger than the Austro-Hungarian. Both of these empires, of course, at the end of World War I, would collapse. So this is something that the German High Command was aware of, but there were some positive, from the German perspective, some positive developments, and one of the most major one was, of course, the collapse of the Eastern Front. When the Eastern Front collapsed, by about the summer of 1917, that led to a revolution that would bring the first Marxist-inspired government saying Marxist inspired, because I don't want to get too political on that, but it was a government based on the writings of Karl Marx that came to power, but of course that government immediately had to deal with all kinds of other differences. But this power was at least willing to negotiate with the Germans to stop the war. Because one of the promises that Lenin did was he told the Russian people, I'm going to get you out of this conflict. And he kept that promise. But it came, as I showed you, at a lot of loss of territory. And that was deeply resented, of course. Now, this big front required a lot of manpower, and it freed all of a sudden German manpower, Austrian manpower that could now be used on other fronts, especially the front in Italy, the so-called Alpine front, which also wasn't a very beautiful front because more people there died of avalanches than of actual shells. It was called the Italians had a term for it. They called it the White Death because it frequently got leveled by avalanches. It was fought in extremely difficult terrain and at very high altitude, where you, of course, it doesn't make fighting very easy. Then this thing that you see over there, that is the very famous Western Front. And when you compare that, it's really just a tiny little one, but that's where most of the dying occurs during World War I. Give you a better perspective of this. Next slide. There we go. That is the Western Front. You can see not a whole lot of movement in 4 years. Basically from August 1914 until late 1918, most of the movement was going, well, this you see over here is the farthest German advance in 1914. Then they're pushed back, and there's a couple of developments I'm going to talk about in a second here. And then you have the last German push that occurs sometime between March and July of 1918. And that's the green area that you see right over here. A couple of important places, I'm not going to talk too much about in detail, but San Miguel, that's a very important salient. That's where for the first time you see a lot of US troops being used in action. And the German High Command was aware of this. Ever since the United States entered into the conflict, they were aware that the clock was ticking. As soon as the United States would put too many boots into France, the Western Front would probably collapse. So it was a race against time. At the same time, the Germans were also aware that their allies were crumbling. So you had to do something. What you had to do is, well, first there was a shift in leadership. And a lot of historians look at this very closely. They call it the silent dictatorship. Some people see here the inspiration of the Nazis. Maybe that goes too far. But you really have the German high control taking over the country. And this is especially after two major setbacks, the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Both battles, the Battle of Verdun was basically a German offensive that after initial success was kind of crushed by the French. Then you have the Battle of the Somme, which is the first major British offensive of World War I, and they're pushing the Germans away. So the person leading the German High Command, an individual by his name is not on there, is Falkenhayn, gets replaced. He gets replaced by two heroes from the Eastern Front. These two individuals, that is Paul von Hindenburg, and that is Erich Ludendorff. Do you know who the guy in the middle is? Yes, Kaiser Wilhelm II. You see he's no longer a young individual. He was, of course, in the 1880s when he came to the throne. And it's interesting that he's on these pictures because there was not much consulting with the Kaiser. Ludendorff and Hindenburg basically said, Billy, you stay out of this, we're going to do this. And that's why it was called the silent dictatorship, because officially they weren't in charge, but they really were. And what you saw very quickly is that they would completely scramble the German economy in high gear, make it a war economy. There wasn't really too much of a war economy before 1916. That also meant that they were ruling by decree. For instance, you couldn't strike You couldn't stay away from work. Wages were frozen. So all of this created already major resentments within Germany. And you could almost say that Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff were almost involuntary architect of the German November Revolution that would occur in 1918. The other thing is that they created a notion that the Nazis would revisit. The notion that in war, the economy is best because the economy is controlled, you fetch high prices, and this sort of notion that you want to recreate the society that you have during wartime, during peacetime, is one that would very much inspire the Nazis, but also the fascists in Italy and many right-wing movements, because they say you don't have any dissent in the middle, we all working towards one major goal. So that's why many people look at the silent dictatorship as the sort of forerunner of fascism that you would, of course, get in the 1920s. So, but to make matters worse, for both the Germans and the Austrians, is, well, first you have a blockade. The British Navy is blockading all of the major harbors, so there's not a lot of food coming in. During the winter of 1916-1917, you have a major failure, potato failure, cutting out one of the major crop that was sustaining both the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire. So what could you do? You had to come up with substitute. The German term Ersatz is actually a term that would become popular again in the 1940s as the Germans would impose this term on the French and the Belgian, on the Dutch and all the other people that they would contact. So basically Ersatz means you don't have the real thing, so you come up with some sort of substitute. One of my favorite here is Capewood, which is basically oats and ground up straw. Very good. Coffee, you don't have coffee because, you know, coffee is obviously something that comes from the outside and a blockade, no coffee, so roasted acorns. Not sure that you know how you get caffeine in there. It's probably not going to have the same effect, so you can imagine. The other thing, ground catnip as tea, that might make cats very happy. I'm not so sure that this is really something that is fit for human consumption. All of this comes also the notion of blood sausage, Blutwurst, which is German, but you have obviously blood pudding, you have equivalent, morcilla in Spain. These are all things that come when you basically have nothing else to do, but you still want to get some sort of protein to your people. So you're coming up with all these substitutes. And the worst thing was probably tobacco. They didn't have access to tobacco. By 1916, 1917, smoking rate probably in Europe is probably higher than 50%. So you have a real problem. You know, how do people get the nicotine? So you basically turn towards those plants that are part of the nightshade family. You know, tomatoes, eggplants, and you make tobacco out of that. You can imagine that, you know, again, not the best. And this is one of my favorite quotes. It comes from an Austrian reporter who basically says, well, the situation in Berlin is serious but not hopeless. In Austria, it is hopeless but not serious. He was basically making fun of it, saying, you know, it's pretty bad. So people are standing in long lines, waiting to pick up the rations, having to make do with ersatz. So all of this ferments an environment, a cultural environment, where people are very dissatisfied. Dissatisfied with the leadership. Of course, most of the Germans would blame the Kaiser, although the Kaiser really wasn't so much in control anymore. But, okay. Okay, I'm just going to click. There you go.
Click it.
Awesome. So this sort of situation forces the German leadership's hand. It forces their hand because they just have received these several divisions coming from the east, and they're looking at the American reinforcement that is now arriving in France. They're looking at the internal situation, which is bad. They're looking at their allies, which is even worse. So you got to do something. And what they do is they basically have a number of operations that pushes them forward on the Western Front. Because the belief here is if we can push through in the Western Front, we can settle this war and then everything will be fine. And that already shows one major problem. The problem is that tactical, in terms of tactics, and I'm going to talk more about this in a second, the Germans were very good. But long-term vision, something that we usually call strategy, not so much. You know, it's like, oh, well, push through and then we'll see what happens. That might work, that might not. Spoiler alert, it did not. But basically what you have is the Germans amassed a lot of artillery, almost 10,000 pieces, to open up a major barrage. And it's interesting to see this on the increase when you're looking at, for instance, the artillery pieces that the Germans used for the Battle of Verdun was about a tenth of this kind of numbers that they had here. 192 German divisions were called up for this last push out of 241. That's why I put the number here. Notice that not every single German division was used. Again, the ones that were missing were usually in the Eastern Front, even after the peace treaty. And yes, they had a little bit of an advantage. There were about 170 Allied divisions, and a number of these divisions were already American soldiers who had come up. So the event it's a very costly first day, about 78,000 casualties, German casualties. But initially the Germans make some ground, and I'll show you this in a second. When Operation St. Michael kind of came to a grinding halt by about April, the Germans decided to attack other segments of the front. Georgette, for instance, was fought in Ypres, or Wipers, as it was known. This was Flanders fields. There were operations that the Germans now moved forwards, Gneisenau and Blücher. These were basically two German heroes from the Napoleonic Wars that now became code word to launch more and more attacks. The last one was also known as the Kaiserschlacht, or the Emperor's Battle, one of the, you could say the mother of all battles. The Germans were gearing up pretty much everything they had. And their tactics were good. That should be said. Their tactics were good because mostly Ludendorff and Hindenburg had learned from the Eastern Front. In the Eastern Front, they had learned that just breaking through the front line wasn't much help. So what you needed was to have better tactics. And instead of sending all of your soldiers over the top, you actually train particular soldiers. These are the very famous stormtroopers, that we of course see more in World War II, but you see them beginning here already by the Battle of Verdun, but really 1917 and 1918, the Germans resort more to these small detachments that instead of attacking the front on all points, just attack them on the weakest point, and then push through, create chaos in the trenches, and then you send your soldiers over. It also involved new tactics in terms of how to use artillery. Because most of the artillery in World War I was used defensively, to basically to defend your trenches and to turn the areas between the trenches into a bloody no man's land. So the new strategy was basically invented also on the east, and it involved marching artillery, shells and explosions. And you would coordinate that with your troops, who had pyrotechnics, with flare guns that they could show, don't shoot us over here because we're right here, so concentrate over there. And what the Germans, I'm not very proud of that, used, of course, was gas. And the way they used three types of gas, you may have heard about this: Blue Cross, Green Cross, Yellow Cross. What's the difference between that? Blue Cross is it basically doesn't stay for very long, and it's non-lethal. But it meant basically to clock your gas mask, so you take it off. And that's when you hit them with Green Cross, which is lethal, but non-permanent. It doesn't stay for very long because you also have your troops moving in, and you want the gas to dissipate before that comes. Yellow Cross, permanent and lethal. That you basically use to immobilize the opposing artillery. And this is also a gas that includes not just chlorine, but also sulfur components that basically makes you exposed skin blister. Very nasty stuff. So all of these are new tactics that were used very successfully in this last push. How successful was the last push? Well, I open up with a quote of Sun Tzu, This is over 2,000 years old now, Art of War. Strategy without tactics is the slowest road to victory. And the second part really applies to the German one. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. Yeah, so a lot of noise, a lot of things, but when you're really looking at Ludendorff and you're looking at what Hindenburg were doing is, well, this sort of notion we push through, we really make sure that we get through, and then we figure out. We'll figure out afterwards what we're going to do. And that didn't work out. It didn't work out that well. Because what happens is on certain districts, I mean, the starvation that you have among the German civilian population has now also moved to the Western Front. So as soon as the soldiers moved into the very rich supplies, especially American supplies coming in, corned beef, alcohol, you name it, it's all there, cigarettes, real cigarettes. So, and they basically stopped. They're saying, oh fine, we broke through and now we have the supplies, we're going to take a break here, we're not going to move forward. So all of these things is stuff that you see. There is a tactical success, one should say, that over the next few months, the Germans would take about 100,000 prisoners and cover about 3,000 square kilometers. Again, 3,000 square kilometers, that's not a whole lot. That's about, give and take, about 1,500 square miles. So that's not a whole lot of territory that they're covering. The strategic neglect is ultimately what will come to haunt the German army in this case. And Sun Tzu said, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And this is what will happen. This was celebrated on the home front, of course. Wilhelm II, the emperor, had all the church bells ring up, calling it a big victory. Well, you know, it didn't turn out to be. And as the big victories were pushed further and further afield, it actually had a very demoralizing effect, again, on the home front. But also a demoralizing effect on the soldiers themselves. And that's important. Because what we see happening very quickly is there's an Allied response to this. It's known as the 100-day offensive. It really is 95 days until November 11th, when the armistice is signed. And it is interesting because here too, it initially starts from a tactical concern. Offensive, the Allies do a small offensive to basically stop the German attack. For instance, one of the most important results is that the last major German offensive, again, to take place in Flanders with the codename Hagen, never occurred, because the Germans were already concerned about all these Allied offensives that were happening. But since these Allies were having tactical success against the Germans, they actually changed from tactics to strategies and became much more effective in putting the breakthroughs through and coming up with a major plan to ultimately defeat the Germans. The other thing is that the Allies used one strategy, I should say one tactic, that the Germans didn't use at all, which was tanks. I'm not saying that the Germans didn't have any tanks, but I think, you may correct me here, but I think the Germans built 17 of their own tanks during the entire World War I. And when you see German tanks moving forward, they usually capture tanks that they had captured from the British. Okay, so, and what we see for the first time is that the Allies very successfully used tanks, almost in this new tactic moving into strategy called blitzkrieg, lightning war, which of course the Germans would then employ during the Second World War. Now, as I said, there's significant US participation. For the first time, you see US troops going forward in large numbers, taking also place, taking part in these major offensives. So you can see these soldiers basically turning the tide, the US soldier turning the tide. So the German command has to come to terms with this. So what do we do now? We have lost a lot of human resources. As a matter of fact, German historians call August of 1918 the collapse of the Western Front, the dark month of the war. I mean, the German army is slowly retreating further and further. So the German high command sees this and they realize we have a choice here. And fortunately, they made the right decision. Unlike the Nazis, in 1944, they decided against a levée en masse. Levée en masse basically means you take every single able possible soldier, that includes children up to the age of 15, 16, individuals who are older, who had served already during the Franco-Prussian War perhaps, and put them in uniform. They've decided against that. And instead, Ludendorff and Hindenburg sent out peace feelers to the Allies, and trying to use the 14 points of President Wilson as some sort of cornerstone to create an end to the war. But, as it often happens, events spiraled out of control. The Germans realized that they had to sue for peace, but as this was happening, Austria-Hungary pretty much disintegrated as an empire. You had an attempt to do further rationing in Austria-Hungary. This didn't come over very well. It triggered strikes and mutinies. It wasn't a total revolution yet, but what you have is that individual units of the Austro-Hungarian Empire basically started suing for peace. You know, whether it was, let's say, the Croats or the Hungarians. You know, all pretty much the empire was disintegrating. Hungarians and other ethnic groups sought the autonomy promised by Wilson's 14 points. So all of this is happening, but Germany is not entirely done yet. There is a last maneuver, and that's always a crazy thing, you know, because and that illustrates that not everybody is on one page, right? Ludendorff and Hindenburg, of course, are operating mostly with the German army, but you know, there is the German Navy. And when you look at the German Navy, there was a major naval race occurring before the war broke out with Great Britain, and Germany narrowed the gap. The gap was also narrowed by introducing new surface ships. The most important one is the Dreadnought. Came into service in 1907, which enabled the Germans to all of a sudden, because of this new technology, to narrow the gaps. But when the war finally broke out, when you put all the ships together, especially after 1917, you throw in the US Navy, the German Navy was greatly outgunned. That's why you also had the success of the blockade, simply because the Germans couldn't do anything about it. There was one major sea battle in 1916. It was ineffective. Ships were lost on both sides, but ultimately it did not break the blockade. It did not enable the Germans to open up trade with other countries. So what happened between 1916 and 1918, well, the majority of the German fleet was packed in mothballs. They were sitting in the ports. They were doing nothing, and in comes a young admiral who had just taken over the Admiralty, Admiral von Hipper, who basically had lots of plans. You know, that's one of the things. The Germans always had lots of plans. You know, that's why Plan 19 was 18, 17, 16. So they were all, you know, thrown out. But 19 basically said, well, we realize that the battle is lost on the Western Front and our troops are retreating. So why don't we take all of our ships for one last push out of the German ports and basically take them to action. And maybe we can still turn the tide or use our advantage. Again, the thinking is mostly tactical, not strategic. And the thinking here is maybe this is bargaining chips, maybe this is something we can use if there are peace treaties. Nevertheless, Admiral von Hipper orders all the ships to start the boilers and to go out. Well, most of the commanders of the ships were saying, okay, we'll do this. The sailors were scratching their heads and saying, no, not a good idea. And many of the sailors had already been in the port cities for a long time. There was a lot of fraternization with the civilian population, including, of course, individuals who came back from the now Soviet Union, coming back and started talking about this. So what you have is mutinies. You basically, not from the commanders of the ships, but the sailors are saying, no, we're not going on this suicide mission. This is completely ridiculous. So, and you have a mutiny that first starts in the German city of Kiel, in the German port of Kiel. very quickly spreads to Bremen, Bremerhaven, Cuxhaven, Wilhelmshaven, all of these are major German port cities. And you have fraternization among the sailors with the civilians. And this comes very close to November 11th. The Kaiser, and this is one of my favorite moments, the Kaiser comes in and is basically talking to Ludendorff and Hindenburg, and he says, "Isn't there something I can do?" And they look at him and say, "What do you propose, Your Majesty?" He says, "Well, I take my best horse, I ride on the back of this horse into the battlefield, and so all the German soldiers will follow my command." Ludendorff looks at Hindenburg. They look at each other going, "Yeah, you can ride out there with your favorite horse, but as you turn around, there will not be no single soldier behind you." Right? There's even a song about this, right? Kaiser Bill went up the hill, took a look at France. Kaiser Bill went down the hill with some bullet in his pants. That's probably what would happen. So they basically, this is the statement. The Kaiser is informed the army will make home in peace and order under its leader and commanding generals, but not under the command of Your Majesty, for it no longer stands behind Your Majesty. That's like a slap in the face. And this is very interesting, because what happens next is Kaiser Wilhelm realizes, okay, so I have no more power, fine. I'm going to abdicate. I'm going to give up my throne. And he goes into exile to Holland. He would actually live until 1940. He would witness the German invasion, and he had hoped that the Nazis would put him in power again. No. Right, they had a lot of illusions there. The other interesting thing is what happens to the silent dictatorship. Do they take responsibility and start negotiating with the Allies? No. Hindenburg came out of retirement. He says, "I came out of retirement. I can come back into retirement. So don't bother me." Ludendorff, who's a little bit younger than Hindenburg, can't go into retirement, but he buys a pair of fake sunglasses, a fake mustache, and he takes off to Sweden, another neutral country. So it's interesting how the leadership just completely vanished, and in its place comes a German parliament that is inexperienced, we should say, but they're the ones that are actually tasked with coming up with a peace. And you see the peace treaties as they're happening right here. That is the Mirror Hall of the Palace in Versailles, where you have everybody come together. And it's interesting, again, historians usually focus on the Treaty of Versailles, which is the treaty between Germany and the Allies. But now we call it actually the Paris Peace Treaties, because in other suburbs of Paris, you have negotiations with the Bulgarians, with the Austro-Hungarians, and with the Ottomans. So it's collectively known as the Paris Peace Treaties. And at the end of my lecture here, I've been going for about 50 minutes now, just a bunch of questions. Is that an end? Is that a beginning? Or, as some of my colleagues now argue since the 1990s increasingly, it's just continuity. In other words, seeing World War I and World War II as really connected. And as we move further and further from these events, our historical perspective on them might change. Because it's interesting that, just one second, it's interesting what now historians looking back at the 30-year war, the original 30-year war, in the 17th century, you also see a lot of peace treaties happening. Right? So they're saying, look, this is not that different. Yes, question?
So the Germans kind of lived up to what you said, moving into World War II, because they just didn't learn. They just repeated the same mistake over again, or what do you think was? How did they not align tactics and strategy?
Actually, they did. No, they did. They learned a lot from that. Actually, one of the things. Guderian, who was a major tank commander, he wrote a book, Achtung Panzer, which translates into English as Achtung Panzer. But it's basically, he learned from the British strategies. He is one of the architects of, in terms of military strategy and tactics, a lot changed in Germany. Politics, there you might be.
Hitler would no longer gassing. He was gassed.
Yeah, Although, you know, when you're looking at the death camps, it's
Yeah.
different.
Oh, no, of course.
Right,
That's
yeah.
a whole different.
And
Hitler was able to use the fact that they lost a lot of land and they got punished by the Allies.
definitely, you're right, absolutely.
I have two things. When I heard mustard gas, which one of those gases would mustard gas?
Mustard gas would be
Yellow.
the green, but also the yellow, because it's both chlorine based. What you have in yellow component is also not just xanth gas, it's sulfur, a component of sulfur that also on top of what chlorine does, it basically turns your lungs into mush.
And then the
So it
second-
operates internally, while the other component, the phosphine gas, basically blisters your skin. So in other words, it attacks you not just internally, also externally.
And then the
Terrible
second
stuff.
question, the 14 points with Wilson, was that the one that formed the League of Nations?
That was part of the
And
14
There was
points.
some major, I forget my history, but was some major flaw with that, rather they didn't abide by it? It was so oppressive that, you know, kicked people out anyway.
It's true. I mean, the League of Nations, I could talk another hour about that. It's a great experiment, but one of the problem, what is interesting, it's sort of a nice forerunner of the United Nations.
Yeah.
I mean, you might not think much of the United Nations, but there's some things in the United Nations that people have learned from the League of Nations. One is you need your own combat troops, right? The blue helmets. The League of Nations didn't have that, right? Because in some cases, in some conflict, it's good to put, I mean, it's dangerous, but to put people right into the conflict to prevent the two parties from fighting. The other thing is the League of Nations, any sort of step that the League of Nations had to decide, they had to do in unison. Every single nation had to agree, and that's
Impossible.
thank you. Yes.
So were they kind of like the forerunner of the United Nations?
Whether
The League of Nations, were they kind of like a forerunner of
yes, yes,
Yeah.
it's different. I mean, clearly it's different. I mean, there's a lot of difference. First, the League of Nations was a lot smaller. I mean, most of the colonies were still colonies. So I think the founding members, correct me if I'm wrong, less than 50 of the League of Nations. And also because the Central Powers were initially not allowed to participate, which was another problem. There was resentment. And then you also didn't allow the Soviet Union. They weren't recognized until much later. I think it was until the early 1930s that they were allowed to join the League of Nations. So that was, again, a problem. It was this sort of elite club. But even this elite club, when it came to, to purge or stop Italian aggression in Ethiopia, couldn't come together. Because, aggression is easily stopped by saying, you're getting no more petrol, no more oil. You're done. Especially a country like Italy that doesn't really have a lot of oil fields. They have a little bit in Africa. You're done. But that didn't happen.
All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yes.
Yeah, that movie was very interesting. It was based on a book.
Right.
And the book basically argued from the loser side, from the German side, that this is what's wrong with war.
Yes.
And made a big film about it.
They did.
Apparently the Nazis banned that.
They did. You're absolutely right. Yes. Because the book talked a lot about propaganda. It talked about the sort of nonsensical thing of war. Because it's just death. And the main character dies literally on one of the last days of the war.
Yeah.
And that's how the book ends. All Quiet on the Western Front, because his death was so insignificant that it didn't have an impact on the
That's a
actual.
good movie to actually watch.
Very good.
1930, what they do is they use a pair of boots. And they go through each person who wore those boots and how they died. They would, the paper tigers were the people in Germany, the older guys, who would send the younger guys in.
Very good.
That's
Yes.
pretty sad.
Excellent. Yes. No questions. Thought that's what I had.
I have a complex sort of question. All my life, I've wondered and studied, like most of us, this war and that war. And some say it's inevitable. There's an underlying human, like sex, very popular, But then
That's
others,
very Freudian.
then others,
Thanatos. Freud uses the term
then
thanatos.
others will say the complexity is like the universe is a huge place, and there's all sorts of explosions going on out there at random or whatever. And can the human race be that way? You know, like it's so complex that this ain't never gonna stop no matter what. It's just gonna keep going.
I'm just a
Now,
historian.
you as a scholar,
Right.
you studied endless hours more than I have.
Mm.
Do you have maybe a simple philosophy like the sun comes up in the morning?
That's a good philosophy, yeah.
That could
Yeah.
sum it up? Or is it really too complex to sum up?
My own philosophy
Yeah.
on this conflict, or just on war in general, or humans will. War in general. Yeah, I don't want to. No, don't want to go there.
It sucks. Right?
Well, yeah. I mean, war is hell, or you know, whatever it is. Yes, absolutely. But I don't know. I mean, I wish my colleague, the psychologist, he would.
I
explain it.
end up with a hopeless feeling at the end of it. That's how I am today. For what's going on, not simply.
Yeah. My colleague actually, he is very Freudian. He sees it as this sort of, you mentioned both of those very important drives within humans. Freud called them eros and thanatos. Right? You know, one is love, sex, and the other one is you know, the sort of notion to kill. And he says that is very strong. Both of those feelings are very strong in ourselves. I mean, Nietzsche talked a lot about, Nietzsche influenced Freud, and Nietzsche would say, yes, it's the will to power. He believes that that's the most powerful drive. I mean, he wasn't a psychologist, he was more a philosopher, but he believes that that's ultimately, he sees it as both destructive, but also as a force that will take us to new horizons. He was somewhat optimistic. You're asking me in the 21st century. You know, war also is interesting, and you know, since I'm coming back from environmental history, one of my major challenges I see is environmental. That is my thing right now. I mean, I'm very concerned. I mean, if the UN, again to bring in the United Nations, the newest UN reports are to be trusted. You know, there's a lot of people a lot of scientists that we have about 10 more good years left, maybe 11. And after that, we have already seen it. I mean, the person I teach environmental history with, our incidents, I mean, I live in Ojai. I was evacuated twice in the Thomas fire. The next year, I was evacuated from Cal State Channel Islands because we had forgot the name of the fire, Woolsey fire. The incidents of fires in California used to be every 20 to 30 years, and now that time span is probably going to be narrowed to 5 to 10. And all of this is just going to get worse and worse and worse. So if there's a battle to be fought, it's not a battle on the battlefield, it's a battle in the town. Because some things can be done. That I believe very strongly. Because the other thing is environmental degradation will also lead to lack of resources and will increase further conflicts. There's a lot of people who now see the conflict in Syria as being very much driven by environmental changes in that very country in the Middle East. So, I'm sorry, I'm just blabbering here, but that's my view. I mean, it's not a simple view as like humans are this and this. I just believe that that's where I see, you know, the course for action.
I think there's a prediction out there that 2050, 2030 is the year where food production will not be able to sustain the population growth. And so, you know, how do you plan for that?
Yes.
Tactics and strategy. Like, what's the strategy to increase, you know, farming and yields and all that? There's a lot of pressure both ways.
Very true. Yes. Yeah.
Any more questions? I'm good, Chuck.
Now, it's just like, I've gotten the impression most wars are out of the economy. Like, I've looked over the history, and, you know, I was recently, they want to build a castle, so they go fight a war so they can get the materials to build a castle. And sometimes they'll guise it under religion or some other more humanistic reason, but for the most part, it's, you know, money and economics. You
But
know.
it's a very,
They have oil.
I'm sorry to put a name on it, that's a very Marxist way of looking at things. I mean, very environmentally driven, so
Yeah,
it's a
there's
very.
oil, there'll be a number of countries, but if there's oil
Right,
there, there'll be a
strategic.
fight there,
Yes,
you know?
right, no, I mean, there's different things. I think nationalism is huge too, which is not necessarily economy.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends. I am not an economic, I'm more a cultural historian. You know, that's why I believe that one of the problems with economy is people decide what is economically important.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, stock market, it doesn't have any intrinsic value in itself, but people believe that it's important because up goes down, goes up, and down. And it's sort of like indicated. And it's the culture that tells us that this is important, right? So that's why cultural historians and economic historians are sometimes.
When the population is denying coffee, like, you know,
Absolutely.
kind of, you know, hey, you want that coffee or not?
They get ticked off, but here's interesting, you know, that's what cultural historians actually do these research. And they have found these incidences where if we all have to ration, we can live with that, right? Because we see it for the greater good, you know, we want to see our country succeed, so we take this. But then all of a sudden, I look over and Beverly holds a big cup of steaming coffee because she has access to some sort of, and I say,
That's not fair.
and then it's like how come you know? So like that's what happens. It's the hardship. If it's suffered by everybody, it's accepted. But you see, there's this elite all of a sudden that has access to more. I mean, the czars, you know, whether it's the Soviet Union, you know, it's a very interesting thing that you believe that. Wait a minute. How come they have more, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and then that's what brings them and creates the resentment. Resentment is because you don't see this. There's a German term for this called Burgfrieden, which means fortress under siege. It's a sentiment that we all in this together. We are encircled by enemies. We have to stand together. We have to stand shoulder to shoulder. And all of a sudden you look over, it's like, oh, you know. And that is what really starts eroding things. So,
Help us out.
yeah.
I think there's one question in the back, Johnny.
So, as an expert of
Behind you though. No, that's you.
That's
You
it.
behind Johnny.
Behind Johnny.
as an expert of recent history, what would you suggest that we do for the near future as a people, as a just in a couple of words or less, not a speech?
Stop being selfish.
What should we do?
Yeah. You know, take a good look at yourself. Yes, absolutely, and try to reduce your carbon footprint as much as you can. And I'm guilty of this. You know, I'm flying. My parents live in Europe, but you see whole countries like in Sweden now they're stopping air travel and switching to trains. And, so the best way to start is take a good look at yourself and what can you improve. From recycling to
So you think,
little projects that you can do on your own
The
backyard.
environment is number one in your point of view. That we
Right.
really should start really focusing on our environment. Yeah.
Yes.
I agree.
Yes, and I'm sorry, and yeah, it doesn't, I myself, you know, when I stare in the mirror and say, yeah, you're not very environmentally conscious sometimes, right? But taking a car, Southern California, a good example, car culture.
Oh, high street.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Horse and buggy wouldn't do it.
Can we give him some applause and tell him?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Ooh, there's a
We
certificate.
have a certificate suitable for framing now, and here's a little pin to work with the city.
Thank you so much.
I'm so glad
Okay.
to come back.
I checked
Yes,
it.
absolutely. Just,
Ladies and gentlemen,
thank you.
I did want to announce that next week is a pretty special program. We're going to have Connie Hornstein and Diane Montner's husband Ray, who's going to play the piano over there. They're going to be doing a radio play. So they're going to be the Brandeis sisters, and that's Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice, whose daughters who were among the first feminists and suffragettes and so forth. So each of them is going to be one of those, and they're going to be pretending that they're on the air and talk about the history of, it's the year 1948, looking back at what happened. I don't want to miss that one, so I hope that you'll be there too. And of course, we don't, I see Howard got some money. Thank you. We're gonna pass the hat, which we always do. This is because we don't get any money other than, the lights and water from the city. So this is all voluntarily,
Don't forget about the chili cook-off.
Also, if you like these programs, some guest speakers, here's a list of our upcoming events, our guest speakers. If anyone would be interested in having a copy of this. Okay, everybody has a copy?
we missed you.
I wonder how I get